Pierce's fist connected with the training dummy so hard the chain holding it snapped. He turned around, saw Evelyn Carter standing at the edge of the mat with a clipboard and laughed. "What are you going to do, schedule the enemy to death?" The entire unit erupted. Evelyn didn't blink. She set the clipboard down slowly and said nothing. That silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Pierce would spend the next 6 months trying to forget what happened in the 4 seconds after that. He had no idea he was already losing. If you're new here, please subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Evelyn Carter arrived at Redstone Tactical Training Center, nobody carried her bags. Nobody saluted. Nobody even looked up from what they were doing. She walked through the main gate with a single duffel bag over one shoulder, wearing the same sand-colored uniform as everyone else. And the only person who acknowledged her existence was the gate guard, who checked her ID with the kind of bored expression that said he'd already forgotten her face before she cleared the checkpoint. That was fine with her. She wasn't there to be remembered. Not yet. Redstone wasn't a place that put out welcome mats. It was a tactical training installation built into the eastern edge of a Federal Reserve in Virginia, spread across 400 acres of mixed terrain. Dense tree lines on 2 sides. Its open field approach. On the third, and a cluster of low concrete buildings at the center that looked like they'd been constructed by someone who genuinely hated windows. The facility trained some of the most specialized combat operators in the country. Not the flashiest. Not the ones who ended up in recruitment posters. The ones who got sent to places where nobody was watching, and everything that happened had to work on the first try. The soldiers stationed here knew who they were. That knowledge lived in the way they moved, the way they talked, even the way they ate fast, quiet, never wasting motion. There was a hierarchy that wasn't written anywhere because it didn't need to be. Everyone inside those gates understood it, felt it, operated within it without being told. And at the absolute top of that unspoken order stood Sergeant Major Logan Pierce. Pierce had been at Redstone for 11 years. Before that, he'd done 3 combat tours, 2 of them in environments that the public would never read about in any newspaper. He was built the way some men are built, when genetics and decades of physical work collaborate on something almost excessive. 6'3", 230 pounds of functional muscle, with hands that looked like they'd been designed for a different species. He could break a man's grip in less than a second. He could take a full-force strike to the chest and keep moving as if it hadn't happened. He had a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw that he never explained, and nobody ever asked about. How was by every metric the unit used the most dangerous man in the room. And he had never, not once in the 11 years, let anyone forget it. Pierce ran the Close Combat Instruction Program at Redstone. That program had produced some of the finest hand-to-hand fighters in the military's special operations pipeline. He ran it the way he ran everything, with maximum intensity, minimal patience, and an absolute certainty that he was right. His philosophy was not complicated. He had said it so many times, it had become something close to a unit motto: strength ends arguments. Everything else is conversation. He believed that, down to the bone. The morning Evelyn arrived, Pierce was in the middle of a live demonstration with 6 second-year candidates. He had one of them in a control hold and was explaining the mechanics of joint pressure while the others watched. He didn't notice Evelyn enter the training room. She found an open spot along the wall, set her bag down without a sound, and watched. She stood there for 40 minutes without moving. Nobody talked to her. Nobody introduced her. The candidates who noticed her glanced over once, registered that she was new, and returned their attention to Pierce, because that was where attention belonged when Pierce was in the room. When the session ended, Pierce finally looked at her. He looked at her the way some people look at things they've already categorized before they've finished looking. A single sweep from boots to face. The kind of assessment that takes less than 2 seconds and is almost always wrong. "Carter," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It was confirmation that he'd read the roster. "Sergeant Major," she said. "You're the new technical assessment officer." "That's right." He nodded once slowly, the way a man nods when something confirms a low expectation. "You have a background in training methodology, systems design, that kind of thing." Among other things, she said. He looked at her for another moment, then turned away. Welcome to Redstone, he said, and went back to his candidates. That was the entirety of their first conversation. But something passed between them in that moment that neither of them spoke about a recognition maybe, or the first small wire pulled taut between two personalities that were never going to be comfortable in the same room. Evelyn had felt it. She'd felt it before in other rooms with other men who looked at her and immediately began building an explanation for why she couldn't possibly be what her file said she was. She didn't resent it. She'd stopped resenting it years ago. She just filed it away. The first week, Evelyn did her job quietly. She observed training sessions, reviewed performance data, spoke with the unit's physical assessment coordinator, and submitted a 12-page preliminary report on pattern gaps in the close combat curriculum that she'd identified in 72 hours of observation. The report was thorough, specific, and contained 3 recommendations that would have required Pierce to restructure roughly 40% of his core program. The report landed on Pierce's desk on a Friday afternoon. He read it Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, every candidate in the unit knew that Sergeant Major Pierce had opinions about it. She's been here 6 days, Pierce said loud enough that his voice carried through 2 open doors. He was talking to First Sergeant Delray, his second, but he wasn't making any effort to keep it private. 6 days. She's never run a live contact session. She's never been through the evaluation protocol. And she's telling me my program has gaps. Delray, who had learned over many years that certain conversations required a man to look interested while contributing nothing, said, Gaps? Pierce repeated, as if the word itself was the offense. 40% restructuring. You know what that report is? That's someone who read about fighting, who sat in an office somewhere and watched video footage and ran a statistical model and decided she understood something she has never actually done. The report, as it happened, was largely correct. But Pierce wasn't wrong that Evelyn had no visible combat record at Redstone, because she had no visible combat record anywhere. Her personnel file, which Pierce had not been given access to, contained several sections marked with classification codes that placed them outside the scope of facility-level clearance. What Pierce could see was a list of institutional credentials, training certifications, and a 3-year assignment at a training development office in the Pacific Command structure. To Pierce, that read as administrator. He had worked with administrators his entire career. They processed paperwork, coordinated schedules, and occasionally published reports that real soldiers ignored. He had never once taken one seriously. Evelyn heard about Pierce's reaction before the end of the day, because Redstone was a small world, and information moved through it the way water moves through sand, without asking permission. She was reviewing equipment calibration records in the assessment office when Corporal Yates, a second-year candidate who seemed to have appointed himself as the facility's informal news service, appeared in her doorway. "You heard," he said. "About what specifically?" she said without looking up. "Pierce. He's not happy about the report." "I assumed he wouldn't be." Yates shifted his weight. "I was 23, eager, and genuinely unsure whether he should be here having this conversation. He said some things. I'm sure he said a lot of things. He said..." Yates paused as if measuring. "He said the report was written by someone who's never been hit." Evelyn set down her pen. She looked at Yates for a moment. "Has he read the full report?" "I don't know. The recommendations in Section 4 specifically address the gap between controlled training contact and live force variable response. It's based on data from 47 sessions across 3 facilities." She picked up her pen again. "If he wants to discuss it, he knows where the assessment office is." Yates nodded. He started to leave, then stopped. "For what it's worth, I thought it was good. The report." "Thank you, Corporal." He left. Evelyn went back to the calibration records. But she sat with that word Pierce had apparently used, hit, and turned it over in her mind for a moment before she let it go. She had been hit. Many times. In places and contexts that Logan Pierce would never have clearance to read about. She had been hit in training and out of training in controlled environments, and in environments where the only rule was that she had to be standing at the end of it. She had never felt the need to announce that. She didn't feel the need to announce it now. The second week was when things began to accelerate. Pierce had apparently decided that the best response to Evelyn's report was a public demonstration of what real combat training looked like. He reorganized 2 of his scheduled sessions into combined demonstrations, pulling in candidates from both cohorts and running them at a pace that had the whole facility buzzing. The sessions were good, genuinely impressive by any standard. Pierce's candidates moved well executed under pressure and showed the kind of instinctive reaction timing that only came from serious repetition. Pierce ran those sessions at the edge of the training mat, arms crossed, watching everything, and the room arranged itself around him, the way planets arrange themselves around mass. He was the center of gravity. He had always been the center of gravity. Evelyn attended both sessions. She stood at the wall, she watched, and she wrote nothing down, which was somehow more unnerving to the candidates than a clipboard would have been. On the third day of the second week, Pierce finally addressed her directly in front of the group. He was demonstrating a close-quarters control sequence, a technique for managing a larger opponent in a confined space. One of the candidates, a serious young woman named Reyes, was struggling with the entry angle. Pierce walked her through it twice, and when the correction didn't land, he stepped back and opened the floor. "Does anyone have a suggestion?" He let the question hang there. Anyone. He was looking at Evelyn when he said it. The room felt it. 15 candidates, all of them suddenly very interested in the middle distance. Evelyn said, "The entry angle is off because the weight distribution shifts too early. She's committing to the rotation before she's established the base. If she sets the left foot differently, 6 inches back and 45 degrees out, the line opens, and the control becomes mechanical rather than muscular. She'd be using structure instead of strength." Silence. Pierce's jaw moved once, like something tightening. "That's a theoretical adjustment," he said. "In a live situation, you don't have time to calculate foot angles." "She's not calculating," Evelyn said. "If she trains the entry correctly, it becomes automatic. The calculation happens in practice, so it doesn't have to happen under pressure." She paused. "That's what practice is for." The silence got heavier. Pierce let it sit for a moment. Then he said, "Combat isn't a classroom." His voice was flat and very controlled. "You can't defeat an enemy by thinking too much." Someone Yates probably made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Evelyn said nothing. She turned back to the wall. But Reyes, when she ran the sequence again, adjusted her foot placement. And the technique worked. And Pierce saw it work. And his expression did something brief and complicated that lasted about a quarter of a second before he put it away. That quarter of a second was everything. After the session, 3 candidates found separate moments to approach Evelyn. Not together individually, casually, as if they happened to be walking in the same direction. The first was Reyes herself. "That worked," she said simply. "The adjustment." "I know," Evelyn said. "How did you see that so fast?" Evelyn considered the question. "I've watched that sequence fail for the same reason about 200 times. Eventually, the pattern is obvious." Reyes nodded slowly. There was something working behind her eyes. "Pierce is going to push back, she said. "He already is. I mean harder." "I know that too." The second candidate was a senior second-year named Holloway, who had the kind of stillness about him that suggested he was always thinking 2 moves ahead. He didn't say much. He just fell into step beside her for about 30 seconds and said, "Whatever's in your file, I'm glad you're here." Then he veered off toward the equipment bay without waiting for a response. The third was Corporal Yates again, who arrived at the assessment office doorway as if he'd been there the whole time. "He's going to challenge you," Yates said. "Corporal." I know what you're doing," Evelyn said. "You're giving me a warning you think I need. I appreciate it." She met his eyes. "I don't need it." Something settled in Yates's expression. Not disappointment, something closer to reassessment. He nodded once and left. The challenge, when it came, was framed as an opportunity. Pierce announced it during the unit's Thursday assembly, the weekly gathering where scheduling and evaluations were reviewed. He stood at the front of the room with the easy authority of a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged there, and he explained that the following week's live assessment would include an open demonstration segment. Any personnel at the facility who wanted to participate in a contact skills evaluation were welcome to do so. He said any personnel, and looked directly at Evelyn for exactly long enough that everyone in the room understood what he meant. The room understood it. Evelyn understood it. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at her notes. After the assembly, First Sergeant Delray found her in the hallway. "You know what he's doing," Delray said. "Yes. He's not going to hold back." "I know." Delray studied her for a long moment. He was a quiet man, careful, the kind of soldier who had stayed alive in difficult places by always reading the room correctly. He'd been watching Evelyn since she arrived, and he'd noticed things that Pierce either hadn't noticed or hadn't wanted to. "I'm not going to tell you to step aside," he said. "But I want you to know if you participate, and something goes sideways, the politics in this unit will make your job very difficult." "Sergeant," Evelyn said, "if I participate and something goes sideways, it won't be going sideways for me." Delray looked at her for another long moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. He walked away without saying anything else. 4 days before the assessment, Evelyn requested access to the facility's physical training records for the past 18 months. It was a standard research request, the kind she'd made a dozen times already, and it was approved within the hour. She spent 2 evenings going through Pierce's training logs, not his personal logs, which were restricted, but the session documentation. Contact hours technique, sequences evaluation scores, the specific combinations he favored under pressure. She was not preparing a training analysis. She was reading a man. Every fighter had patterns. Not because they were careless, but because excellence creates its own kind of habit. The more proficient a fighter was, the more refined those habits became, the more deeply grooved. Pierce's instincts were extraordinary, his reaction timing, his control, the way he managed distance. But reaction timing at his level meant he had trained himself to respond to certain inputs in certain ways. He had done it so many times and so successfully that those responses were now effectively automatic. Automatic responses could be predicted. Predicted responses could be managed. Evelyn spent 6 hours with those logs, and by the end of the second evening, she had what she needed. She put the records away, turned off the light, and went to sleep. The night before the assessment, Yates found her at the equipment bay, running footwork drills alone. No one had asked her to be there. No one was watching. She was just moving slowly and precisely through a set of transitions that didn't look like anything recognizable to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. Yates watched from the doorway for almost 3 minutes before she stopped. "You've been doing this the whole time," he said. She looked at him. "What do you mean? You haven't been sitting in the office. You've been training." "I train every day," she said. "I've trained every day for 15 years. Yates was quiet for a moment. He looked at the mat where she'd been working at the particular set of positions her footwork had traced. He had enough training himself to recognize that what she'd been doing was not casual maintenance work. "What was that sequence?" he said. She considered whether to answer. Then she said, "It's a redirection framework. You don't oppose incoming force, you absorb the angle and return it along the attacker's own line of motion. Instead of stopping someone, you complete their movement for them, just not the way they intended." Yates thought about that. "That's what you were recommending for Reyes." "Same principle, different application." "Where did you learn that?" Evelyn picked up her bag. "Somewhere that doesn't appear in my accessible personnel file," she said. "Get some sleep, Corporal." She walked past him toward the door. "Lieutenant," he said. She stopped. "He's going to come at you hard," Yates said. "Really hard. He's been thinking about this for 2 weeks." She didn't turn around. "I know," she said. "So have I." She walked out, and Yates stood in the empty equipment bay for a long time, looking at the mat, thinking about what she'd said. "I complete their movement for them, just not the way they intended." He had a feeling that sentence was going to mean something very different tomorrow than it meant tonight. The morning of the assessment arrived, the way significant mornings sometimes do, ordinary on the surface, charged underneath, as if the air itself had been briefed on what was about to happen. The unit assembled in full. Not just the candidate's administrative staff support personnel, the facility's 2 visiting evaluation officers from the regional command structure, who happened to be on site for a quarterly review. 61 people in total arranged in a wide semicircle around the main training floor, which had been cleared of its usual equipment and marked with a simple contact boundary. Pierce was already there when Evelyn arrived. He was standing at the center of the mat in training gear talking to Delray, and he had the particular quality of stillness that very confident men have when they are completely certain of an outcome. Not tense, not coiled, just settled, the way a mountain is settled. He watched her cross the room. She didn't look at him. She set her bag along the wall, changed out of her jacket in 30 seconds, and walked to the mat boundary. The room had gone quiet already. The way rooms go quiet when they recognize that something real is about to happen. Pierce said loudly enough for the room, "Still time to observe instead of participate. Nobody will think less of you." It was almost the exact thing he'd said to her that first day. Almost word for word. The room registered it. A few candidates exchanged glances. Evelyn stepped onto the mat. "Thank you," she said, "for the consideration." And that was all she said. Pierce's expression didn't change. But something in his eyes shifted, a slight recalibration, the way a man's attention sharpens when a situation doesn't respond to his pressure the way it's supposed to. He rolled his neck once, settled his feet, and they began. What happened in the first 90 seconds was not on the surface dramatic. Pierce moved. Evelyn moved. He applied force. She redirected it. He adjusted. She adjusted faster. He came in with a controlled, dominant grip and found that the grip didn't land the way it was supposed to. Not because she was faster or stronger, but because she wasn't where the grip expected to find her. The candidates closest to the mat started leaning forward without realizing they were doing it. Pierce escalated. He used the sequences he'd spent 11 years perfecting, the combinations that had ended every serious bout he'd ever been in. He used them with full intent, full power, without the courtesy modulation that instructors typically applied in demonstrations. Evelyn let him, and then she took each one apart. Not dramatically. Not with flourish. With the quiet, precise economy of someone who had looked at each of these movements in a training log and identified exactly where they could be turned. She wasn't blocking. She was completing his force vectors along trajectories he wasn't accounting for, and every time he committed to a movement, she was already in the position that made that movement work against him. After 4 minutes, Pierce's breathing had changed. After 6, there was sweat on his face that had nothing to do with temperature. And the room. The 61 people arranged around the mat had gone from expectant to stunned to something that didn't have a clean word for it. Some of them were holding their breath. Reyes had one hand over her mouth. Holloway was perfectly still, watching with the expression of someone witnessing something they will describe accurately to people for the rest of their life and know they'll never be fully believed. Pierce came in hard on the 8th minute, abandoning subtlety, going for the kind of overwhelming force that had always, without exception, ended the argument. It was his strongest combination, the one he had thrown 1,000 times. Evelyn moved into it rather than away from it. One step, a quarter turn. One hand placed at exactly the right point of Pierce's arm, and Pierce Sergeant Major Logan Pierce, 11 years at Redstone, decorated combat veteran, a man who had not been put on the ground in 7 years, went down. Not stumbling. Not slowly. Down, controlled, fully neutralized, with Evelyn's hand at his shoulder and her weight distributed in a way that made any immediate recovery physically impossible. The room didn't react immediately. There was a lag, the half-second delay of 61 people simultaneously processing something that contradicted their understanding of how the world worked. Then the silence became absolute. Pierce lay on the mat, not in pain, not injured, but completely stopped, looking up at the ceiling. And Evelyn stood above him, breathing normally, her expression unchanged from the expression she'd worn on day 1, when she set her bag down against the wall and started watching. She stepped back. She offered her hand. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he took it. He was on his feet, and the room still hadn't made a sound. Evelyn said quietly, directly to him, not for the room's benefit, The entry angle in your dominant combination opens a line at the 8 o'clock position. You've probably never had anyone go into it instead of away from it. Most people move away because it looks like the more dangerous direction. She paused. It isn't. Pierce looked at her. His face was doing something complex and private that he was managing with considerable effort. No, he said after a moment. It isn't. And that was all that passed between them on the mat. But in those 4 words, the first honest, unguarded words. Pierce had spoken to her since she'd arrived. Something shifted. Not resolved, not finished, but shifted. Like the first half-degree movement of a compass needle that means an entirely different heading is coming. The room held its breath for one more moment. Then Pierce turned, walked to the mat boundary, and said in a voice that had lost none of its authority, but it had gained something harder to name. Assessment continues. Reyes Holloway, you're up. And the morning went on. But nothing at Redstone Tactical Training Center went on quite the same way after that. The woman who had arrived with one bag, who nobody had looked at twice, who had stood against the wall for 40 minutes on her first day, without anyone speaking to her, she was still standing against the wall. But now, 61 people knew what she was. And more importantly, Logan Pierce knew what he didn't know. Which, as Evelyn had understood from the beginning, was always the more dangerous discovery. Nobody said anything on the walk back from the training floor. That was the thing that stayed with Yates longest afterward. Not what had happened on the mat, but the silence that followed it. 61 people moving through corridors and doorways, and back to their assignments, and not one of them speaking above a murmur, as if they were all privately negotiating with something they'd just witnessed and hadn't finished processing yet. Pierce had walked off the floor first. Straight back, shoulders square, the way a man walks when he is using his body to hold something together that his face might otherwise betray. Del Rey fell in beside him and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to do, and Del Rey knew it. Some situations didn't need words. They needed the dignity of being allowed to settle before anyone tried to touch them. Evelyn had stayed on the mat for another 10 minutes after the assessment continued. She watched Reyes and Holloway run their sequences. She gave no further commentary. She stood at the boundary line and watched with the same even attention she'd had since her first day, and when it was over, she picked up her bag, walked to the assessment office, and went back to work. Yates had followed her at a distance, not sure why. He stopped at the doorway and watched her sit down at her desk and open a calibration file, as if the past 45 minutes hadn't rearranged anything. "You're not going to say anything," he said. "About what?" "About what just happened." She looked up briefly. "What would I say?" "I don't know. Something. Anything." He gestured vaguely. "You just put the most feared man at this facility on the ground in front of the whole unit, and you're reading a calibration report." "The calibration data still needs reviewing," she said. "It was due yesterday." Yates stood there for a moment, genuinely uncertain whether to be awed or frustrated. He settled on something in between. "You planned that," he said. "The whole thing. You weren't just defending yourself. You knew exactly where you were going to take him and when." Evelyn said nothing. "That sequence, the entry at the 8 o'clock line, you found that in his training logs." She looked up again. This time she held his gaze for a moment longer. "Get some food, Corporal. Assessment afternoons are long." He left, but he didn't get food. He went to the candidates' common room and sat down across from Reyes and Holloway, who were already there, already debriefing in low voices, and he said, "She read his logs. She mapped the whole thing before she ever stepped on the mat." Reyes looked at him. "Of course she did," she said, and her voice had something in it that wasn't quite reverence, but was in the same neighborhood. "That's what she's been doing since she got here. She's been reading everything." Holloway leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. "The question," he said quietly, "is what happens next." That was the question everyone was asking. Pierce didn't reappear in the main facility that afternoon. His office light was on. Yates could see the strip of light under the door when he passed, but the door stayed shut and nobody knocked on it, and the specific quality of that closed door communicated something that the whole unit absorbed without being told. Leave it alone. Give it air. Let the man think. Del Rey ran the afternoon evaluation session in Pierce's place, which he did competently and without comment, offering no explanation for the substitution that anyone dared to ask about. By evening, 3 versions of the morning's events were circulating through the unit, each one slightly more dramatic than the last. In the first version, Evelyn had simply outmaneuvered Pierce on a technical point. In the second, she had taken him apart with a technique nobody had ever seen before. In the third, which Yates suspected was the one that would survive into legend, she had spent 2 weeks studying Pierce like a problem to be solved, identified the single angle in his entire fighting system that had never been challenged, walked onto the mat, and put him there in under 10 minutes without raising her voice or changing her expression once. That third version was, by the standards of accuracy that mattered, essentially true. What none of the versions included, because nobody had been close enough to hear it, was what Pierce had said when she helped him up. 4 words. Yates had been watching from 12 feet away, and he'd read the shape of them on Pierce's face more than heard them. No, it isn't. He turned those 4 words over for a long time, because the thing about Logan Pierce, the thing that people sometimes forgot about men who had built their entire identity around being unbreakable, was that when something broke through anyway, the response could go in one of 2 directions. It could calcify into something worse, harder, more defensive. The kind of anger that doesn't look like anger because it's wearing the face of professionalism. Or it could crack something open. Yates didn't know yet which direction Pierce was going. Nobody did. But by the next morning they started to find out. Pierce arrived at the facility at 0530, 40 minutes before anyone else, which was unusual. He typically arrived at 0600, exact as if his body ran on military scheduling by biology. Delray found him in the equipment bay, running a solo contact drill against the weighted bag, and something about the quality of that work was different from what Delray had seen before. It was slower, more deliberate. Pierce wasn't punishing the bag. He was studying something, working through something, running a movement, and then stopping and running it again from a different angle. Delray watched from the doorway for 2 minutes without speaking. Pierce stopped. Without turning around, he said, "The 8 o'clock line." "What about it?" "I've thrown that combination 3,000 times, Pierce said. He was still facing the bag. "In 11 years, I have never had anyone go into it. Not once. Not in training, not in evaluation, not in live contact." He paused. "Because it looks like it's the more dangerous direction." "But it isn't," Delray said. "But it isn't." Pierce turned around. His face was composed, but there was something working behind it, something that was either going to resolve into insight or into something harder. She knew that because she spent 2 weeks reading my logs. "That's what assessment officers do." "She wasn't doing an assessment," Pierce said. "She was preparing a response. There's a difference." He picked up a towel, looked at it without seeing it. "The difference is, she treated me like a problem worth understanding, instead of just an obstacle." Delray said nothing for a moment. Then, "Is that a complaint?" Pierce looked at him. Something moved across his face that might, in a different man, have been the beginning of a rueful expression. "No," he said. "It's not a complaint." I went back to the bag. Slower than before. More careful. Delray left him to it. That exchange would not be repeated to the candidates because Delray was constitutionally discreet. But the fact of Pierce's early arrival and the manner of his solo work were noted and discussed because soldiers noticed everything, especially things that deviated from established pattern. Reyes noticed. She arrived at 0610, saw the light in the equipment bay, and made a calculated decision to walk past the open door without looking in. She was perceptive enough to know that some processes needed space, and whatever Pierce was working through this morning was one of them. Holloway, who arrived at 0615, made the same calculation and the same decision. Yates arrived at 0620, saw both of them standing casually near the water station, in a way that was definitely not casual, and understood immediately. He got himself a cup of water and joined them. "How long has he been in there?" he said quietly. "Since before I got here," Reyes said. "He's not running his regular drill," Holloway said. "Listen." They listened. The rhythm from the equipment bay was wrong, too slow, too interrupted with pauses that didn't fit the usual pattern of Pierce's conditioning work. "He's reworking something," Yates said. Reyes nodded. He's looking for the line she found. That thought landed quietly among all three of them. The idea of Pierce, their immovable, unchallengeable Sergeant Major, spending his early morning searching for the gap that a new officer had identified in his own technique, not with resentment, but with what sounded from the rhythm of his work like genuine inquiry. That was not what they'd expected. What they'd expected was a closed door, a cold shoulder, and the kind of professional freeze that powerful men deployed when they needed to pretend something hadn't happened. This was different. This was something that required a word they hadn't yet found for it. Evelyn arrived at 0635 and walked directly to the assessment office without stopping at the water station or the equipment bay or anywhere else. She sat down, opened her files, and resumed exactly where she'd left off the day before. Not because she was indifferent to what was happening, she was watching everything as she always was, but because she understood that the most important thing she could do right now was exactly what she'd been doing since she arrived. Her work. Without drama, without performance, without any signal that she believed yesterday's demonstration had changed her position in the unit. It had changed things. She knew that. But the change would mean nothing if it calcified into a single dramatic moment. A story the unit told about the new officer who put Pierce on the ground and then traded on it. That wasn't what she was here for. That was never what she'd been here for. She pulled up her analysis of the curriculum gap she'd identified in the third-year assessment protocol and went back to work. An hour later, Pierce knocked on the open door of the assessment office. She looked up. He was in his full-duty uniform now, which meant he'd had time to shower and change after his early equipment bay session. His face was arranged into its professional composure. But something was different about the way he was standing in her doorway. The particular quality of weight that he normally carried, that gravitational certainty. The unconscious physical announcement of someone who owned any space he occupied was present, but the edges of it were different, slightly more held, slightly less ambient. He said, "I'd like to see the full version of the report." She said, "It's in the shared assessment drive. Section 4 through 7 cover the structural recommendations. I read sections 1 through 3. "I know," she said. "You stopped at the restructuring percentage." A pause, short but textured. "I did," he said. "Section 6 has the phased implementation model. The restructuring doesn't have to be simultaneous. It's designed to be integrated over a 12-week period without disrupting active candidate cohorts." Another pause. Pierce's jaw moved fractionally. "You designed a transition protocol before you submitted the original report." "I always design a transition protocol," she said. "It's easier to decline a recommendation if the implementation looks impossible. I try to remove that objection in advance." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "That's either very strategic or very arrogant." "Probably both," she said. Something happened at the corners of his eyes. It wasn't a smile exactly. It was the precursor to the small mechanical event that happens in a face just before the decision about whether to actually smile is made. He didn't make the decision. But the precursor was there, and they both knew it. "I'll read sections 4 through 7 this afternoon," he said. "I'm available if you have questions." He nodded once, turned to leave. "Sergeant Major," she said. He stopped, turned back. "The sequence you were working on this morning," she said. "In the equipment bay. You're looking for the 8 o'clock entry from the defensive side. You want to know how to close it." His expression did not change. "You heard me in there." "No. But you arrived early, you worked solo, and the rhythm I heard when I passed was too interrupted for your conditioning drill. You were deconstructing something, not building something. It's a different cadence." She paused. "Do you want me to walk you through the closure mechanics?" The silence this time was longer, heavier, not hostile. Pierce's silences had stopped being hostile somewhere in the past 18 hours, though she hadn't been certain of that until this moment. This silence was something else. Something that cost him something to hold without speaking. "Yes," he said finally. "I do." 0400 tomorrow, she said. "Equipment bay. Before the candidates arrive." He nodded, walked away. Evelyn went back to her files. Outside the assessment office window, Yates was crossing the courtyard toward the training building, and he happened to pass close enough to see Pierce come out of the assessment office doorway with an expression that Yates had never seen on that face in 2 years at Redstone. He couldn't name it immediately. He cataloged it and carried it with him through the morning, turning it over at intervals, and by lunch he had a word for it. The word was humility. Not defeat, not concession, not the hollow performative acknowledgement that proud men sometimes offered as a substitute for actually changing anything. Genuine humility. The specific internal event that happens when someone of real capability encounters something that legitimately exceeds their model of the world, and instead of defending the model, they begin quietly revising it. Yates sat with his lunch and thought about how rarely he'd seen that word applied to anyone above the rank of captain. He thought about what it meant that it was being applied now, the 0400 session. The next morning happened without an audience, which was exactly what both of them intended. Pierce was already in the equipment bay when Evelyn arrived, which told her something about where his head was. A man who wanted to demonstrate resistance would have been late or absent, forcing her to come to him. He was there before her, which meant he'd already decided that whatever this was, he was going to do it properly. She walked him through the closure mechanics for 45 minutes. She showed him the entry angle from the receiving side, how the body position looked from the inside of the technique rather than the outside, what the force vector felt like when someone committed to it, where the critical transition point was that made the redirection possible. She ran it slowly at first, then at training speed, letting him feel the mechanics from both positions. Pierce was a fast study. She had expected that you didn't reach his level without the ability to absorb and integrate information quickly. What surprised her was his patience. He asked questions. Specific, intelligent questions, the kind that came from someone who was genuinely trying to understand a system, rather than simply find a workaround for an immediate problem. After 30 minutes, he said, "This isn't just a counter to that one combination." "No," she said. "This is a foundational principle. The whole redirection framework, it works on any committed force vector, not just mine." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Why isn't this in the standard curriculum?" "Because it requires the practitioner to move toward danger rather than away from it," she said. "That's psychologically very difficult to train, especially in a program that's built on strength dominance as the primary framework. The body resists it until it becomes automatic, and it takes much longer to become automatic than standard defensive response." Pierce absorbed that. "So you need a different training architecture, not just a different technique." "Yes," she said. "That's what Section 5 of the report addresses." He looked at her. "I owe you an apology," he said. "It came out clean, no preamble, no softening, no defensive qualification wrapped around it. Just the sentence, flat and direct, the way Pierce did everything." She said, "You don't need to. I said things in this first week that were designed to discredit you, rather than engage with what you'd written. In front of the candidates. That was wrong." He held her gaze. "I do things correctly, or I don't do them. That wasn't correct." She held his gaze for a moment. "Accepted," she said. "And the report," he said. "Sections 1 through 3, I read them looking for reasons to dismiss them. That's also wrong." "That's a fairly normal human response to criticism of something you've built," she said. "Normal isn't good enough at this level," he said. "That's what I've always told my candidates. It should apply to me." She nodded. They finished the session in a different register than they'd started it, not warm, not familiar, but squared. Two people who had recalibrated their understanding of each other and were moving forward on the basis of what was actually true, rather than what either of them had initially assumed. When they were done, Pierce said, "I want to implement Section 5, the phased integration. But I want to work through the training architecture with you before we take it to the candidates. How much time do you want?" 2 weeks, he said. "I want to understand it well enough to teach it correctly before I put it in front of anyone." "All right," she said. He picked up his gear. At the door, he stopped without turning around. "What's in your restricted file?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Things that would have made this easier if you could have read them." He was quiet too for a beat. "Did it ever occur to you to just tell me?" Did it occur to you to ask? Another beat. Then, fair, he said, and walked out. Evelyn stood alone in the equipment bay for a moment, breathing in the quiet, and something in her chest settled that she hadn't known was still tensed. Not victory, she'd never wanted this to be a victory. Something closer to resolution. The beginning of something, rather than the end of something. She picked up her bag. She had calibration reports due. The next 2 weeks at Redstone moved differently than anything had moved before them. Pierce and Evelyn met for 90 minutes every morning before the candidates arrived. Pierce read the full report, all 7 sections, and came to each session with written questions, which Evelyn answered in detail. He pushed back on 3 of her structural recommendations, and in 2 of the 3 cases, his pushback was correct, because he knew the candidate population and its specific failure patterns better than she did, and she revised the recommendations accordingly. In the 3rd case, she held her position and explained why, and he disagreed for 4 days before her reasoning finally resolved into something he could accept. It was by any standard one of the more productive professional collaborations either of them had been part of. The candidates noticed the change before anyone articulated it. They noticed it the way people notice shifts in weather, not one identifiable moment, but an accumulation of small signals. Pierce citing the assessment report in his teaching. Pierce demonstrating the redirection framework alongside his standard strength-dominant sequences, presenting them as complementary rather than competing approaches. Pierce stopping mid-demonstration to say, "There's a second way to read this situation," which was something he had never in anyone's memory said before. Reyes noticed it first. She mentioned it to Holloway, who nodded as if he'd been watching it for days. Yates noticed it third and said something about it out loud in the common room, which he immediately knew was a mistake. Not because it was wrong, but because naming it brought everyone's attention to a process that was working precisely because nobody was drawing attention to it. But the thing. Nobody knew. The thing that was working below the surface of all of this, below the professional calibration and the morning sessions and the curriculum revision, was that Pierce was also asking questions that had nothing to do with technique. He started on a Thursday, 12 days after the assessment. They had finished their morning session, and Evelyn was packing her bag when Pierce said, "The Pacific Command assignment. 3 years in training development." He said it to the middle distance, rather than to her. "That's what's in the accessible portion of your file." "Yes," she said. "What's actually in the restricted portion?" She looked at him. It wasn't a question exactly. It was more like a door being tried firm, but not forcing. "Why do you want to know?" she said. "Because I've been watching you work for 2 weeks, he said. "And the things you know, the way you apply them, that doesn't come from an office. It doesn't come from research. I've been in this long enough to know the difference between someone who has studied something and someone who has done it. You've done it, whatever's in that file." She was quiet for a moment. "I was attached to a specialized defensive tactics unit for 4 years before the Pacific Command assignment," she said. "Pre-mission operator preparation. I developed and ran close combat readiness programs for teams going into environments where standard doctrine wasn't applicable." Pierce looked at her. Classified environments. Everything about it was classified. "What kind of environments?" "The kind where what I taught them had to work on the first attempt," she said. "Because there wasn't going to be a second one." The silence that followed was different from any of the silences they'd had before. Pierce sat with it for the moment, and what moved across his face was not guilt. He wasn't that simple, but something adjacent to it. The particular expression of a man recalculating a situation and realizing that his original error was larger than he'd understood. "I misjudged you badly," he said. "You misjudged my file," she said. "You didn't have the information." "I had enough information to ask before I decided," he said. "I didn't ask." She closed her bag. "No, you didn't." He nodded once. Not the performative nod of a man demonstrating that he was listening. The slow internal nod of a man who has arrived somewhere he didn't intend to go and is deciding what to do from here. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead. Why did you take my hand on the mat?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because it was offered," he said. "And because taking it was correct." Some men wouldn't have. Some men are more interested in what the moment looks like than what it means, he said. I've tried not to be that kind of man. Yesterday. He stopped, corrected himself. 11 days ago. I don't know if I succeeded. You took the hand, she said. That's not nothing. How was quiet again? Then, with the particular directness that seemed to be the only register Pierce had available when he was being honest. What are you actually here for? Not the official assignment. What's the real objective? Evelyn looked at him for a moment. The question deserved a real answer. The program here produces excellent individual fighters, she said. The data shows that, but there are patterns in how those fighters respond to non-standard force variables. Unexpected angles. Force redirection situations where strength dominance isn't available that suggest a gap in the training framework. The regional command wants to know if that gap is structural or individual, and if it's structural, what it would take to close it. She paused. That's the official answer, and the real one. She picked up her bag. The official one is real, she said. The rest is just that I'm very good at this particular work, and there are not very many people who are, and so I end up in facilities like this one with programs like yours, and the quality of the outcome depends largely on whether the senior instructor decides to engage in good faith. She met his eyes. You're engaging in good faith. 2 weeks late, he said. Better than not at all, she said. She walked to the door, stopped, not because she needed to, because something in the morning felt unfinished. Pierce, she said. He looked at her. You built something real here, she said. The program what you've constructed over 11 years, it's genuinely excellent. The candidates it produces are exactly what this facility needs to produce. What I'm working on isn't a correction, it's an addition. She paused. I should have led with that. He said nothing for a moment. Would I have heard it if you had? She thought about that honestly. Probably not, she said. You needed to see the addition work before you were willing to consider that your system had room for it. He was quiet. The mat, she said. That was the only language that was going to land. He held her gaze for another beat. Then very quietly, with an expression that had something in it she hadn't seen from him before, something that was still finding its shape. I know. She walked out. Behind her in the equipment bay, Sergeant Major Logan Pierce stood alone for a long moment, and then he went to the bag, and he ran the redirection entry from the defensive side, slowly feeling the mechanics of it, the way she'd shown him understanding for the first time in his career, what it felt like to move into the dangerous direction rather than away from it. The technique worked. Of course it worked. That was the thing about Evelyn Carter. Everything she brought to Redstone worked. Not because she was smarter than the people around her, though she was, or because she was better trained, though she was that too. But because she understood something about how change happened that most people never figured out. You couldn't install a new framework over an old one. You had to first demonstrate in a language the other person could actually receive that the new framework existed and was real. The mat was the demonstration. Everything after it was the installation. And Pierce, working alone in the equipment bay at 0455 on a Thursday morning, with the rest of the facility still dark and quiet around him, was starting to understand that the most significant thing that had happened to his program in 11 years hadn't been the moment he went to the ground. It was the moment he stood back up and started asking different questions. The question he hadn't yet answered, hadn't yet been asked, was how deep the installation was going to go. How much of what he'd built was flexible. How much of what he'd believed about strength and leadership, and what it meant to be the most capable person in a room, was going to survive contact with what Evelyn Carter was showing him. He didn't know yet. But for the first time in 11 years at Redstone, Sergeant Major Logan Pierce was genuinely uncertain about something that mattered, and he was in a way he would not have been able to articulate and wouldn't have tried to grateful for it. The curriculum revision went live on a Monday, which was Pierce's choice. He said, Mondays had a psychological advantage that candidates came in from the weekend with their defenses slightly down and their capacity for new input slightly higher, and Evelyn filed that observation away, because it was the kind of thing that only came from 11 years of watching people learn under pressure. The first session ran for 3 hours. Pierce led it, which was also his choice, and Evelyn sat in the back row of the observation area and watched without a clipboard, without a pen, without anything that would signal she was evaluating rather than witnessing. That distinction mattered. Pierce was doing something difficult, integrating a framework that challenged his foundational assumptions into a program he'd built from nothing in front of candidates who had trained under his original model for months or years, and he was doing it without defensiveness, without hedging, without any of the subtle self-protective moves that instructors made when they were teaching something they hadn't fully accepted yet. He had accepted it. That was the thing. Somewhere in those 2 weeks of 0400 sessions and written questions and honest conversations in the equipment bay, Pierce had moved from tolerating the new framework to owning it. He taught it the way he taught everything, with full commitment, full authority, the weight of his conviction behind every word. When he demonstrated the redirection entry, he did it cleanly, and when a candidate asked why they were learning to move toward force rather than away from it, Pierce said without hesitation, "Because moving away from force is what your attacker expects. What your attacker does not expect is someone who understands their own momentum better than they do." He paused. "I learned that recently. Pay attention." 3 candidates in the front row exchanged glances. They all knew what that meant. Everyone in the room knew what it meant. And Pierce knew they knew, and he let it stand, which cost him something, and he did it anyway. And that, more than any technical demonstration, more than any formal policy revision, was the moment the room shifted for good. Evelyn in the back row said nothing. But she exhaled very slowly through her nose, and the small knot that had been sitting at the base of her sternum for 3 weeks quietly dissolved. After the session, Reyes found her in the hallway. "He cited you," Reyes said. "He cited the framework. He said, 'I learned that recently, while demonstrating a technique you showed him. That's citing you.'" Evelyn kept walking. "He's a good instructor. He absorbed the material and made it his own. That's exactly what should happen." Reyes fell into step beside her. "Can I ask you something? You're going to regardless. Why didn't you establish yourself the moment you arrived? You had the background. You had the clearance or whatever's in that file. You could have walked in and made Pierce's program look inadequate from day one. Why did you wait for him to force the confrontation?" Evelyn considered the question for a few steps. "Because making his program look inadequate wasn't the objective," she said. "The objective was improving it. Those are not the same thing. If I'd walked in and demonstrated superior credentials, Pierce would have entrenched. The candidates would have chosen sides. The facility would have spent 6 months in a political stalemate, and nothing would have changed." She glanced at Reyes. "He had to choose to open the door. I couldn't open it for him." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "So the challenge on the mat." "He opened the door," Evelyn said. "I walked through it. And then you handed him back the keys." "It's his program," Evelyn said simply. "It should stay his program, just a better version of it." Reyes walked beside her for another moment, processing that. "You've done this before," she said. It wasn't quite a question. Several times. In those classified environments. Evelyn didn't answer, which was an answer. They reached the intersection where their paths diverged. Reyes toward the candidate quarters, Evelyn toward the assessment office, and Reyes stopped. "Lieutenant," she said. Evelyn stopped. "Whatever's in that file," Reyes said, "I hope someone writes it down someday." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "Do your job so well that your file writes itself," she said. "That's all any of us can do." She turned and walked away. Reyes stood at the intersection for a long moment, and then she went back to the candidates' quarters and sat down with her training notes and started reviewing the redirection framework with a seriousness that hadn't been there before, because something about that conversation had rearranged her understanding of what seriousness looked like. The second week of the new curriculum was when the visiting evaluation officers made their formal presence known. Colonel Harlan Marsh and Major Diane Sue had been on site for the quarterly review since before Evelyn's assessment demonstration, but they'd been operating in the administrative layer meetings with facility command records reviews, the standard machinery of regional oversight. They had been at the assessment. They had seen what happened on the mat. But they hadn't said anything about it publicly, and their official review calendar hadn't reflected it, and so the unit had largely filed them away in the category of institutional observers who took notes and sent reports upward and rarely affected anything at the operational level. That categorization turned out to be wrong. Evelyn found out on a Wednesday afternoon when Colonel Marsh appeared in the assessment office doorway with the particular quality of arrival that senior officers had when they wanted to signal that this was not a casual visit. "Lieutenant Carter," he said. "Colonel?" She stood. "Sit down." He came in, which he hadn't done before in the previous 3 weeks. Any interaction had happened in common spaces. The fact that he was coming into her office closing the door behind him was information. He sat across from her. He was a compact man in his late 50s, economical, with his movements with the kind of face that had been difficult to read for so long that it had forgotten how to be easy to read. He had an excellent combat record in his own right. Evelyn knew this because she always knew it, and he had spent the last 8 years in regional command oversight, which was a role that required a different kind of intelligence than the combat record. "I've been watching the past 3 weeks," he said. "I assumed you were. Not just the assessment, the mornings, the curriculum revision, the sessions with Pierce." He paused. "I've been watching the whole sequence." She said nothing because nothing was what the moment called for. "I want you to tell me," he said, "what you assess Pierce's long-term trajectory to be, based on what you've observed." She was careful here because this was a question with more dimensions than its surface. "He's integrating the new framework with genuine commitment," she said. "His teaching is already more sophisticated than it was 3 weeks ago. The candidates are responding to the expanded model. I think the program here will be significantly stronger in 6 months than it is now." "That's the program," Marsh said. "I asked about Pierce." She held his gaze. "He's re-examining some foundational assumptions about strength and leadership. That process is real, not performative. Whether it resolves into lasting change depends on factors that are outside my ability to predict with certainty." "Factors like what?" "Whether the re-examination is supported or isolated," she said. "Men at his level who go through genuine recalibration, they need an environment that reinforces the change rather than pressuring them to revert to the version of themselves that the institution is most comfortable with. If the facility rewards what he was before, he'll drift back. If it rewards what he's becoming, he won't." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. "What's he becoming?" She chose her next words carefully. "A better version of what he already was," she said. "Not a different person. The fundamentals that make him exceptional, the discipline, the commitment to the candidates, the absolute intolerance for half measures, those are intact. What's changing is his understanding of what strength means in practice. He's learning that the most powerful position isn't always the loudest one." Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your original assignment here was 6 weeks. "Yes." "I'm extending it to 4 months. She absorbed that. "May I ask why?" "Because what you've started here is worth finishing," he said. "And because the regional command has 3 other facilities with similar structural gaps in their close combat programs, and I want to understand your methodology well enough to apply it systematically." He paused. "You're not just fixing Pierce's curriculum. You're developing a replication model." "I wasn't aware that was the scope," she said. "It is now." Something moved through her, not surprise exactly, but a reconfiguration of the horizon she'd been working toward. 4 months. 3 additional facilities. A replication model. This was a different thing than what she'd walked in expecting. Larger. More exposed. More dependent on what happened here going right in ways that could be documented and transferred. "I'll need full access to the restricted assessment archives," she said. "Not just Redstone, regional." "Done. And I'll need Pierce's formal partnership on the replication framework," she said. "Not just his cooperation, his active participation in documenting what's working and why. He has 11 years of pattern data in his head that isn't written down anywhere. That knowledge has to be captured." Marsh looked at her. "Will he agree to that?" "Ask him," she said. "I'm asking you." She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "He'll agree." Marsh nodded once. I'll schedule the formal briefing for Friday. Should I tell Pierce before then? No, Marsh said. I'll tell him myself. He stood, started for the door. Colonel, she said. He stopped. The 3 other facilities, she said. What's the common variable in the structural gaps? He turned. What do you mean? Every facility with this kind of gap has a common variable, she said. Something in the command culture, the training lineage, the evaluation criteria. Something that created the same blind spot in different contexts. What is it? Marsh looked at her for a moment. The evaluation system rewards individual performance metrics, he said. Speed, strength, reaction time. It doesn't reward adaptability, redirection, the ability to operate effectively when the standard approach fails. So the instructors teach what gets rewarded, and the gaps are the things the reward system didn't ask for. Evelyn nodded slowly. So the curriculum gap isn't the core problem, she said. The evaluation criteria are. That's above the facility level, he said. I know, she said, but it's worth saying out loud. He held her gaze for another moment. Something moved through his expression, not quite approval, something more specific than that. Recognition, maybe. The look of a man who had been waiting for someone to say a particular thing and had started to wonder if anyone was going to. It's in my Friday brief, he said. Has been for 3 years. He paused. Nobody at the regional command has been willing to pull that thread. What would it take, she said. A methodology, he said, and enough data to make the argument impossible to dismiss. He looked at her steadily. Which is why your 4 months here matter more than you might have understood when I walked in. He left. Evelyn sat with that for a long moment. The assessment office was quiet around her. The sounds of the facility moved through the walls, the distant rhythm of a contact session. Someone's boots in the corridor, the hydraulic hiss of the main training room's ventilation. She thought about the evaluation criteria, the way a reward system shaped behavior at every level without anyone ever deciding to shape it. It just happened gradually, the way rivers carved channels following the path of least resistance until the path became the only path anyone could see. She thought about 3 other facilities with the same gap, about how many candidates had moved through those programs and carried those gaps with them into operational environments where the standard approach was the one thing that wasn't going to be available. She thought about the 4 words Pierce had said on the mat. No, it isn't. And she thought about how rarely that kind of honesty arrived without being earned the hard way. She opened a new document on her terminal and typed a single line at the top. Redstone Replication Framework Preliminary Methodology. Then she stopped. She sat back. She thought for a moment about where the first sentence should go, about what the argument needed to establish before it could build about what Marsh had meant when he said nobody at the regional command had been willing to pull that thread. She started writing. Pierce found out about the extension on Friday, 30 minutes before the formal briefing, because Delray told him, not because Marsh had leaked it, but because Delray had a network of institutional awareness that made it nearly impossible for significant information to move through Redstone without his knowing it within the hour. He appeared in the assessment office doorway at 0730 with an expression that was doing careful work to remain neutral. 4 months, he said. That's what I was told. And the replication framework. Yes. He stood in the doorway for a moment. You knew when you walked in here that this was going to be bigger than a 6-week assessment. I knew it had the potential to be, she said. I didn't know what shape it would take. But you designed for it. She looked at him. I designed for the possibility, she said. There's a difference. He came in, which he'd started doing over the past 2 weeks without making a production of it, sitting across from her, the way colleagues sit without the performance of hierarchy that had characterized their early interactions. Marsh is going to ask me to document the 11 years, he said. Everything that's not written down. He is. That's months of work. I know. On top of running the program. Yes. Pierce was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the preliminary methodology document on her terminal. She hadn't turned the screen, and he wasn't reading it, just noting its existence. "Why do you need my documentation specifically?" he said. "You could reconstruct most of it from session records." "Session records tell me what you did," she said. "They don't tell me why. They don't tell me what you were reading in the candidates when you made adjustments. They don't tell me the decision logic behind the sequencing. That's pattern recognition built over 11 years of live contact with hundreds of candidates. It doesn't exist anywhere except in your working memory." She paused. "If it walks out of here with you when you eventually leave, it's gone. And the next program director starts from scratch." Pierce absorbed that. Something in his face moved through several configurations before settling into something that wasn't quite discomfort, but was adjacent to it. "You're talking about making my instincts legible," he said. "Yes. That's—" He stopped, started again. "That's an unusual thing to ask someone." "I know," she said. "It requires a level of self-examination that most people find uncomfortable, especially people who operate at the level where instinct feels indistinguishable from knowledge." "Can it even be done?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've never tried it with someone at your level. I've documented programs, but I've never tried to document the instructor's internal decision architecture in real time. It might not be possible to make it fully legible, but even a partial documentation is worth having." Pierce was quiet for a long time. Outside the office, the facility was coming alive around the Friday briefing schedule, voices in corridors, the sound of candidates moving toward the main assembly room. "All right," he said. She looked at him. "I'll do it," he said. "The documentation, however you need it structured." He paused. "On one condition." "What condition?" "Whatever we produce, the replication framework, the methodology, the curriculum architecture, my candidates are referenced by anonymized case data only. I don't want their individual performance records attached to a regional policy document without their knowledge." She looked at him steadily. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that was not in the set. "Agreed," she said. "That's already in the methodology." Something in his expression shifted. "You already included it." "It's standard research ethics," she said. "I included it in the first draft." He nodded once, slowly. "You keep doing that," he said. "Doing what?" "Anticipating the objection I have before I raise it," he said, "and having already addressed it." "It's not anticipation," she said. "It's preparation. I try to think through what reasonable people in your position would legitimately want to protect. Then I protect it before they have to ask." Pierce looked at her for a long moment. "Where did you learn that?" he said. "In rooms where I needed people to trust me before they had any reason to," she said. "It was the fastest way." He nodded again, stood. "Briefing in 30 minutes, he said. "I'll be there." He reached the door, stopped without turning. This was becoming a pattern between them, the conversations that happened at doorways at the last possible moment before departure, as if the most honest things needed the protection of being said while one person was already leaving. "Carter," he said. "Sergeant Major." "The document on your terminal," he said. "The preliminary methodology." "Yes." "How far along is it?" She glanced at the screen. 12 pages, she said. "It's going to need about 60 more." He was quiet for a moment. "Is there a version in it where this works?" he said. "The regional level, the evaluation criteria, actually changing how the system measures what matters." She considered the question honestly. "There's a version where it's possible," she said. "Whether it happens depends on factors above my pay grade." "But you're building the argument." "I'm building the evidence base," she said. "The argument is already there. Someone just has to be willing to make it in the right room." Pierce stood in the doorway for another moment. She couldn't see his face, but she could read something in the set of his shoulders, a particular quality of tension that wasn't stress or resistance. It was the specific tension of a man who was considering something much larger than the thing he'd thought he came in to discuss. "Marsh has been trying to make it for 3 years, Pierce said. "I know. He needs the methodology to make it stick." "Yes." "So do it right," Pierce said. "Whatever it takes, do it right." He walked out. Evelyn turned back to her terminal. She looked at the 12 pages for a moment, then looked past them at the shape of the argument that 60 more pages needed to build. She thought about what Pierce had just done, walked in to negotiate the terms of his own participation in a project he hadn't been told about until 30 minutes ago, arrived at an agreement in less than 10 minutes. Extracted one protective condition that demonstrated he was thinking about his candidates rather than himself, and walked out having committed to months of additional work with zero visible reluctance. That was not the man who had laughed at her in front of the unit 4 weeks ago. That was not the man who had said, "Combat isn't a classroom," with the comfortable authority of someone who had never had that certainty challenged. That was something the mat had started, and the equipment bay mornings had continued, and the 14 days of honest conversation had built into something that she hadn't been certain was possible when she'd arrived. She went back to the document. She typed the second line of the methodology, then the third. The Friday briefing lasted 2 hours. Marsh presented the scope of the extended assignment with the clean efficiency of someone who had already decided the outcome and was presenting it as information rather than proposal. Pierce sat across the table from Evelyn and said almost nothing during the formal portion. He asked 2 precise questions about resource allocation, received answers, and nodded. Delray took notes. The 2 visiting evaluation officers said what needed to be said and left immediately after. When the room cleared, Pierce and Evelyn were briefly alone in it. A coincidence of slow packing, and Pierce said without looking up from his binder, 62 pages. Probably closer to 75, she said. By the time I run the data properly. He nodded. When do we start the documentation sessions? When you're ready. He closed the binder. Monday, he said. 0400. Bring a recording device. She nodded. He picked up his binder and walked out of the briefing room, and in the corridor outside, Yates was passing with a stack of assessment folders and saw Pierce come out of the briefing room with something on his face that he'd never seen there before. It wasn't contentment exactly. It wasn't resolution. It was something more active than both of those, the expression of a man who had identified a new direction of travel and had committed to it without reservation and was now genuinely curious about where it went. Yates stood in the corridor after Pierce passed and thought about the fact that 3 weeks ago he'd been watching a man who was utterly certain of everything he knew. And now he was watching a man who was asking new questions. It was Evelyn Carter who had done that. Not the mat was just the opening. It was everything after the mat. The 0400 sessions, the report discussions, the careful, patient, methodical work of showing Pierce something true until he had no choice but to see it. Yates thought about what Reyes had said. Whatever's in that file, I hope someone writes it down, and he thought about the 75-page methodology sitting half-built on a terminal in the assessment office, and about Pierce agreeing to spend months making his 11 years of instinct legible. They were writing it down, he realized, just not the way Reyes had meant. Something else was happening at Redstone now. Something that had started with a confrontation and a body on a mat and 4 honest words, and was growing into something that touched the evaluation criteria at the regional level and the training architecture at 3 additional facilities, and a policy argument that someone had been trying to make for 3 years without the evidence to make it stick. And it had started because Pierce had challenged a woman he'd never taken seriously, and she had walked onto the mat and shown him exactly what he didn't know. And then this was the part that Yates kept coming back to, the part that separated what had happened at Redstone from every other confrontation story he'd ever heard in his military career. Instead of walking away with her victory, she had handed him the key and said, "It's your program. Make it better." He was still standing in the corridor when Reyes found him. "You're in the way," she said. "Yeah," he said. He moved. "Hey, do you think this works, the regional level thing? The evaluation criteria. Do you think it actually changes?" Reyes looked at him. She thought about it for a genuine moment, not the reflexive optimism of someone who wanted the answer to be yes, but the honest consideration of someone who had been watching the past 3 weeks carefully. "I think," she said, "that 3 weeks ago I would have said no. I would have said the system is the system, and one person's methodology document isn't going to move it. And now," she picked up her assessment folders. "Now I've watched Evelyn Carter move Logan Pierce," she said. "So I've updated my estimate of what's possible." She started walking. "Get out of the hallway, Yates." He got out of the hallway. I went to his training session. He ran his sequences. He practiced the redirection framework with a seriousness that had a different quality now than it had 2 weeks ago, because he understood now that what he was practicing wasn't just a combat technique. It was an argument, a demonstration, a proof that could be captured and replicated and taken to 3 other facilities, and eventually to a briefing room at the regional level, where someone had been waiting for 3 years for the evidence to walk through the door. He moved into the force vector, rather than away from it, the way Evelyn had shown them, and he felt the mechanics of it engage the way she'd described structural, rather than muscular leverage, rather than strength, and he understood in his body, as well as in his mind, why it worked. Because the force was already moving. You just had to know where it was going and get there first. The documentation sessions started on a Monday and immediately became something neither of them had anticipated. Pierce arrived at 0400 as agreed, sat down across from Evelyn's recording device with the posture of a man preparing to give a deposition, and then opened his mouth and discovered that making 11 years of instinct legible was significantly harder than agreeing to do so. The first session lasted 40 minutes and produced approximately 4 usable minutes of material. Not because Pierce was being evasive, he wasn't, but because the process of translating automatic knowledge into explicit language required a kind of cognitive reversal that his mind kept resisting. He would start to describe a decision and then stop, not because he didn't know the answer, but because the answer lived below language in the part of the brain that acted before words arrived. "Start smaller," Evelyn said, after the 3rd time he stopped mid-sentence and looked at the wall with the expression of a man trying to catch water with his hands. "Don't try to describe the decision. Describe the moment before the decision. What did you notice? Not what did you think, what did you notice?" He looked at her. "There's a difference. Noticing happens before interpretation," she said. "If I ask what you decided, your brain gives me the post-processed version. If I ask what you noticed, I might get something closer to the raw input." He tried it. The candidate's weight shifted to the back foot 0.3 of a second before he committed to the attack. His eyes moved left before his body moved right. His breathing changed shorter, faster, about 5 seconds before he initiated. "That," Evelyn said. "That's what I need." Pierce looked at the recorder. "That's not what I thought I knew," he said slowly. "I thought I knew the decision. But what I actually know is the pattern that precedes it." "Yes." "So I'm not teaching combat," he said. "I'm teaching pattern recognition." "You're teaching both," she said. "But the pattern recognition is the foundation, and it's invisible in your curriculum because you've never had to make it explicit before. You just demonstrate the response and trust the candidates to develop the pattern sense through repetition." "Which some of them do," he said. "And some of them don't," she said. "And the ones who don't are the gap in your output data." Pierce sat back. He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that had a great deal happening inside it. "The candidates I've always been most frustrated with," he said slowly. "The ones who have every physical attribute but can't perform consistently under pressure. They're not failing on the response side. They're failing on the pattern recognition side." "Yes? And I've been treating it as a discipline problem," he said, "or a commitment problem, because I couldn't see what was actually failing." "Because it was invisible," she said, "even to you." The silence that followed, that was different from the earlier ones. It had a specific weight, the weight of a man recognizing not just a gap in his curriculum, but a gap in his own understanding that had real consequences. Candidates he'd written off. Evaluations he'd scored incorrectly. Judgments he'd made about people's capacity based on a framework that was missing a foundational variable. "How many candidates?" he said, and then stopped. Evelyn waited. "How many candidates in 11 years, he said, do you think I've assessed incorrectly because of this?" She could have softened it. She chose not to. "I don't know," she said, "but it's worth finding out." He nodded. Not the quick, decisive nod he used when he'd already made a decision. The slow, absorbing nod of a man, accepting the full weight of something he'd rather not be accepting. "Pull the records," he said. "The candidates I flagged as inconsistent performers. I want to re-examine them through the pattern recognition lens." "That's going to take time." "I know." He looked at her. "Do it anyway." She added it to the methodology framework. The session ended 20 minutes later, and both of them left with more to think about than they'd arrived with, which was becoming the consistent quality of their 0400 mornings. Not comfortable, never comfortable, but always generative. 3 days later, the records pull turned up a name that changed the temperature of everything. The name was Sergeant First Class David Kwan, and he had been assessed as an inconsistent performer in his second year at Redstone, flagged by Pierce for what the evaluation record described as failure to perform reliably under high variable contact conditions, and transferred out of the advanced program to a standard training track. That transfer had happened 19 months ago. Kwan was currently assigned to a base in Georgia, running standard infantry training, a career path that had been quietly narrowed by a single evaluation outcome. Evelyn flagged the record on a Thursday morning and showed it to Pierce without comment. Pierce read it for a long time. Then he put it down on the table and looked at the wall. "Tell me what you see in his assessment data," Evelyn said. "Excellent physical metrics," Pierce said. His voice was flat and careful. "Strong technical execution in controlled conditions. Significant degradation under high variable pressure." He paused. "Which I read as unreliability. And now, how was quiet?" "Now I read it as undeveloped pattern recognition," he said. "He had every physical tool. He just couldn't read the pre-contact signals fast enough under pressure, which is trainable, which I could have trained." He stopped. "Which I didn't train." "You didn't know it was what was failing," Evelyn said. "That's not good enough," Pierce said. It came out hard and flat, not directed at her, but at himself with a directness that was harder to listen to than anger would have been. "At this level, I didn't know is not good enough. I had a candidate who was being evaluated on a framework that was missing a variable I hadn't identified. I assessed him on that incomplete framework. I transferred him." He looked at the record. "I changed the course of his career based on an evaluation that was wrong." The room held that for a moment. "How do we fix it?" he said. "I can flag the record for formal reassessment," she said. "With the methodology documentation as supporting evidence, we can request a review of his evaluation outcome. That's above facility level, it goes to Marsh. Do it." "Pierce. Do it today," he said. "Whatever process it takes. I don't want that record sitting the way it is for another week." She pulled the record into the methodology files and drafted the reassessment request that afternoon. It took 2 hours to write correctly, not because the facts were complicated, but because the language had to be precise enough to initiate a formal review without triggering a wider audit that would take months. She showed it to Pierce before she sent it. He read it twice, made one correction to a date reference, and signed it. Marsh received it at 1600 on Thursday. He called Evelyn at 1645. "The Kwan record," he said. "Yes, sir." "How confident are you in the reassessment rationale?" "The pattern recognition gap is documentable," she said. "The evaluation criteria that produced the original outcome are the same criteria I've been analyzing for the regional framework. This is a direct case-level application of the methodology." A pause. "Pierce signed this." "Yes, sir." Another pause. "He requested the reassessment of his own evaluation outcome." "Yes, sir." The silence on the line lasted long enough that she could hear Marsh thinking through the institutional mechanics of what Pierce had just done. A senior instructor formally requesting review of an assessment he'd conducted on the basis of a methodological gap he'd identified with help from the officer he'd publicly humiliated 4 weeks earlier. "That took something," Marsh said finally. "Yes, sir," she said. "It did." "I'll process it," he said. "This week." He disconnected. Evelyn sat with the phone for a moment after the call ended. She thought about David Kwan in Georgia running standard infantry training, not knowing that a file with his name on it had just been put back into motion. She thought about the 19 months between Pierce's assessment and this afternoon and all the accumulated weight of time that an unjust outcome carried while it sat undisturbed. She hoped Marsh was as fast as he'd said. He was. The formal reassessment notification arrived in the system on Friday morning, 36 hours after the request. Pierce found out from Delray, who found out from the administrative coordinator, who processed incoming regional communications, and he came to the assessment office at 0800 without his usual door knock. "Friday," he said. "I know," she said. He moved it quickly. "What happens now?" "Kawan gets contacted by the regional assessment office," she said. "They review his original evaluation against the updated methodology. If the reassessment supports the gap theory, and I believe it will, he gets a formal revision to his record and the option to reapply to the advanced program." Pierce stood in the doorway. "He might not want to come back," he said. "That's his choice to make," she said. "We're giving him back the option. What he does with it is his." Pierce nodded. He looked at the floor for a moment, just a moment, the brief downward glance of a man who is carrying something and acknowledging it. "There are others," he said. "Probably," she said. "I want to review every inconsistent performer flag from the past 11 years, he said. "Every one. I want to know which of those outcomes were driven by the pattern recognition gap rather than actual performance failure." She looked at him. "That's a significant undertaking." "I know. It could take months." "Then it takes months," he said. "These are people's careers. If I put a wrong outcome on someone's record, I want to know about it, and I want it corrected." He looked at her directly. "All of them, not just the ones that are easy to find." She held his gaze. "I'll build the review protocol," she said. "We can run it alongside the documentation sessions." He nodded, started to go. "Pierce," she said. He stopped. "What you just asked for," she said. "Voluntarily reviewing 11 years of your own evaluation outcomes for potential error. That is not something most people at your level would do." He looked at her for a moment. "Most people at my level haven't been shown that their framework was incomplete," he said. "Once you know the framework was wrong, the outcomes it produced aren't defensible. You either review them or you pretend you don't know what you know." He paused. "I'm done pretending I don't know what I know." He left. Evelyn added the comprehensive review protocol to the methodology framework. It was going to make the document significantly longer and the timeline significantly more complex. But as she began building the architecture for it, she recognized that it was also going to make the argument at the regional level significantly stronger. A senior instructor voluntarily auditing 11 years of his own evaluation outcomes and formally requesting corrections was not just a personal act of accountability. It was institutional evidence that the methodology worked, that identifying the gap produced real behavioral change at the decision-making level, not just curriculum adjustment at the surface level. That was what Marsh had been missing for 3 years. Not the argument he'd had the argument. He'd been missing the proof that the argument changed something. Pierce was the proof. She wrote that into the methodology that evening carefully, without sensationalism, in the precise language of assessment documentation that would survive a regional review board. But the core of what she wrote was this: when a high-performing, deeply entrenched senior instructor was shown a genuine gap in his framework clearly and without institutional pressure, and given the tools to understand it, he corrected his own practice and initiated review of his own prior outcomes. The system did not have to force the correction. The individual made it. That was the argument. Not that the instructors at these facilities were failing, they weren't. It was that the evaluation framework was producing blind spots that affected even the best instructors, and that addressing those blind spots produced rapid self-directed improvement at every level of the program. She sent the updated methodology draft to Marsh at 2200 on a Friday night. He responded at 0615 Saturday morning with 3 words. "This is it." The following Monday brought something that nobody at Redstone had been expecting. 2 additional officers arrived from the regional command, not evaluators, not observers, but program specialists, who had been sent specifically to review the methodology document and assess its applicability to the 3 other facilities Marsh had mentioned. Their names were Major Okafor and Captain Briggs. They were both serious, technically proficient, and visibly aware that they were arriving at a facility where something significant had already happened. They went to Evelyn first, which was correct. Then they went to Pierce, which was also correct. What they didn't anticipate, what Evelyn had anticipated, and Pierce had decided in advance without telling her, was that Pierce brought Evelyn into his meeting with them. He found her in the assessment office at 0900 and said, "Okafor and Briggs want to review the 11-year data with me. I'd like you there." She looked up. "That's your evaluation data, and your methodology," he said. "I don't want to explain the analytical framework incorrectly. You explain it better than I do." She considered this. "You could brief me, and I could provide written notes." "I could," he said. "I'm asking you to be in the room." That was different. Pierce asking her to be present in a meeting with regional specialists about his own evaluation record was a statement of something that went beyond professional courtesy. It was a public alignment, a visible signal to the regional command that he and Evelyn were operating as a collaborative unit, rather than as an assessor and a subject which had specific implications for how the methodology would be received and who would be seen as its institutional champion. I knew that. He was doing it deliberately. "All right," she said. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Okafor was sharp and asked hard questions, the kind of questions that were designed to find the weakest point in an argument and press it. Briggs was quieter but more detailed, going line by line through the methodology framework and flagging places where the evidence base needed strengthening. Pierce answered questions about his evaluation data with the same flat directness he brought to everything, and when a question touched the Quan record, which it did 40 minutes in, he answered it without deflection. "I assessed a candidate as an inconsistent performer," he said. "The assessment was based on a framework that was missing a variable I hadn't identified. The candidate was transferred out of the advanced program. That outcome is currently under formal reassessment." He paused. "It was a wrong call. The framework that produced it has been revised." Okafor looked at him for a moment, then at Evelyn, then back at Pierce. "You're formally acknowledging an evaluation error," he said. "Yes," Pierce said. "On the record." "That's what formally acknowledging means," Pierce said without edge, but with zero give. Okafor was quiet for a moment. He made a note. Briggs made a note. Something passed between the two of them that was too small and too fast to read, but its valence was legible. It was the look of two people who had arrived expecting one kind of meeting and were having a different one. After the formal review, Okafor stayed behind while Briggs went to review facility documentation with Delray. He sat across from Evelyn in the assessment office Pierce had left to run his afternoon session and said, "How did this happen?" She looked at him. "Could you be more specific?" "Pierce," he said. "I've reviewed his file. 11 years at Redstone. Decorated record. No formal complaints. No disciplinary actions. Consistently excellent candidate output. And in 4 weeks, he's voluntarily restructured his curriculum, initiated a comprehensive review of 11 years of evaluation outcomes, and formally acknowledged an assessment error to a regional review team." He paused. "That does not happen. Not at this level. Not without significant institutional pressure. And there's no institutional pressure in this record." "No," she said. "There isn't." "So how?" She thought about how to answer this honestly. "He's a man who has always operated according to his best understanding of what excellence required," she said. "When his understanding changed, his behavior changed. That's not remarkable, that's just who he is." She paused. "The harder question is why his understanding changed." And the answer, "I was shown something true," she said. "Clearly without institutional pressure in a language he could receive. And he was given the time and space to integrate it without being required to perform acceptance before he'd actually reached it." Okafor looked at her for a long moment. "The methodology document describes that as framework first intervention," he said. "Demonstrate the gap before proposing the correction. Don't propose the correction and then demonstrate the gap. The order matters." "Yes." "That's counterintuitive to how most programs run assessments," he said. "Most programs propose the correction first. The resistance you get shapes the whole implementation." "I know," she said. "I've been in those implementations. They work for surface-level curriculum revision. They don't produce what happened here." "What happened here," Okafor said slowly, "is a senior instructor who is currently in an afternoon session teaching pattern recognition to his candidates, using a framework he developed himself over the past 3 weeks based on a conceptual foundation." he arrived at through his own analytical process during documentation sessions with you. He looked at her steadily. He didn't receive a new curriculum. He built one. Yes. That's the difference. That's the whole difference, she said. Okafor closed his notebook. The other 3 facilities, he said. The senior instructors at those facilities, are they Pierce's? She understood the question. I don't know yet, she said. Pierce was exceptional in a specific way. He had the intellectual honesty to revise his own framework when the evidence required it, and the personal integrity to accept the implications of that revision. Not everyone at his level has that. Some of them will. She paused. Some of them won't. And for the ones who won't, the methodology still works, she said. It just works at a different level. If the senior instructor can't be moved, you work with the candidates directly. The change happens from inside the cohort, and eventually the culture shifts around the instructor. It's slower and less complete, but it's still real. Okafor nodded. You've done that version too, he said. Several times. He stood. Lieutenant Carter, he said, I want to ask you something directly, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. Go ahead. When you arrived at Redstone 6 weeks ago, he said, was Pierce the real assignment? She met his eyes. The curriculum gap was the real assignment, she said. Pierce was the variable that determined how it could be addressed. But you assessed him before you assessed the curriculum. I assess the environment before I assess the problem, she said. Always. The problem exists inside the environment. If you don't understand the environment, your solution won't survive contact with it. Okafor looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation technically required. Then he said, the regional command is going to want you at the next facility as soon as this methodology is finalized. I know, she said. Is that what you want? The question surprised her. Regional specialists didn't typically ask what she wanted. Yes, she said after a moment. It's what I came back for. He nodded, left. Evelyn sat alone in the assessment office and thought about what she'd just said. What I came back for. She hadn't meant to say it that way, but it was true, and she'd been avoiding the truth of it for the 4 years between the classified unit and Redstone. She'd spent those 4 years in the Pacific Command's Training Development Office, doing work that was competent and useful and entirely safe, and the particular restlessness that had been her companion through all 4 of those years was the restlessness of someone who had learned to do something at a high level and was not being allowed to do it. This was what she did. Not curriculum revision, that was the surface. What she did was walk into rooms where the existing order had calcified around a set of assumptions that were producing invisible damage. Identify the specific point where the calcification had started and create the conditions under which the person responsible for the order could see it clearly enough to revise it themselves. Without coercion. Without politics. Without the kind of institutional pressure that produced surface compliance and deep resistance. She did it because she was good at it, and because it mattered, and because very few people were willing to do it the slow way. The slow way was the only way that actually worked. Pierce walked into the assessment office at 17:45 after his afternoon session. He looked like he'd had a productive 3 hours. There was a particular quality of forward momentum in him after sessions that went well, a slightly looser quality of movement. He sat across from her and said, "How was Okafor?" "Sharp," she said. "Good questions." He asked about Quan. "I know, you handled it correctly." Pierce looked at her. He seemed surprised. He was. By what specifically? By a senior instructor acknowledging an evaluation error on the record without being required to, she said. He's not used to seeing that. Pierce absorbed that. What is he used to seeing? Qualified acknowledgement, she said. Language that sounds like accountability, but preserves institutional deniability. The evaluation framework at the time suggested rather than, "I made a wrong call." "That's not accountability," Pierce said. "That's cover." "It's very common cover," she said. He shook his head. Not in surprise, Pierce had stopped being surprised by institutional behavior a long time ago, but in the specific weariness of someone who had maintained a personal standard in an environment that didn't always reinforce it. "What's the Quan timeline," he said, "for the reassessment?" Marsh said 2 to 3 weeks, she said. "The formal review board meets monthly. If they can get it on the current calendar, it moves fast. And if they can't?" "Next month," she said. Pierce was quiet for a moment. "I want to write to him," he said. She looked at him. "To Quan?" "Yeah, that's..." She measured this. "Unusual. Before the reassessment is finalized." "I know," he said. "But he's been sitting with a wrong outcome for 19 months not knowing it was wrong. The reassessment process is going to take at least 2 more weeks. That's 19 months and 2 weeks that he's been operating under a false record." His jaw tightened slightly. "I don't want to wait 2 more weeks to tell him that I'm looking at it." She thought about the institutional mechanics. A personal communication from Pierce to Quan before the formal reassessment was completed was irregular, potentially complicated, and absolutely consistent with who Pierce had turned out to be. "Keep it factual," she said. "Don't characterize the original assessment. Just tell him the record is under formal review and that you initiated it." "That's all I'm planning to say." "All right," she said. He wrote it that evening and showed it to her before he sent it. It was 4 sentences. It said that the evaluation record from his advanced program assessment was under formal regional review, that Pierce had requested the review, that the process would be complete within the month, and that Quan should contact the regional assessment office with any questions. It said nothing about why the review had been requested. Nothing that could be read as an admission before the formal process had run. Nothing that created an institutional problem. But it was 4 sentences that Pierce had chosen to write when he could have chosen to say nothing, and that choice was visible in every word. She told him it was fine to send. He sent it. Then he looked across the desk at her and said, "Okafor asked about the other facilities." "Yes, he asked me the same." "What did you tell him?" "That the methodology works regardless of the senior instructor's response," she said. "Just faster and more completely when the instructor is Pierce." Something moved through his expression. A brief private thing that he managed quickly. "He asked me if I'd be willing to consult on the methodology rollout at the other facilities," he said. "Remotely. Documentation review, not travel." She looked at him. "What did you say?" "I said I'd think about it," he said. "I'm telling you so. You know it's in the conversation, not because I've decided." "Fair," she said. "What do you think?" She considered it honestly. "I think your institutional knowledge of what this methodology required to work at Redstone is more valuable than almost any other input the other 3 programs could receive," she said. "But that's the analytical answer. The question of whether you have the bandwidth and the inclination is yours." He nodded, sat with it for a moment. "The candidates here still need the full version of me," he said. "Not a version of me that's being divided across 3 other programs." "Then that's your answer," she said. "Tell Okafor I'll contribute documentation and written review," he said. "Not real-time consultation. My primary obligation is this program and these candidates." She nodded. "I'll tell him." He stood, picked up his binder. "The documentation session tomorrow," he said. "I want to work through the pattern recognition taxonomy and live contact conditions. I need you on the mat." She looked up. "On the mat. You're the only person here who can create the force variables I need to demonstrate while I'm describing the recognition sequence," he said. "Del Rey can't do it at the right level. Neither can any of the candidates." "All right," she said. 0400, he said. "Wear your gear." He walked out. Evelyn sat for a moment after he left, and what she felt was not amusement exactly, but something close to it. The particular feeling of a situation that had arrived so far from where it started that the starting point was almost unrecognizable. 6 weeks ago, Pierce had stood in front of 61 people and told her there was still time to step aside. Tomorrow morning he was going to ask her to get on the mat with him so he could articulate the things he couldn't articulate any other way. The circle of that was not lost on her. She closed her files. She thought about Quan in Georgia and the 4 sentences traveling through the institutional system toward him, carrying the weight of something that Pierce hadn't had to do and had done anyway. She thought about Okafor's question, "Is that what you want?" and the answer she'd given without deciding to give it. Outside the facility, the night had settled into the particular deep quiet of a training base between operations not silent, because a military facility was never truly silent, but resting, reduced to its essential rhythms. The sound of 2 people doing security rotation in the east corridor. The distant hum of the equipment bay's ventilation running overnight. Somewhere in the candidate quarters, a light still on. Probably Reyes, Evelyn thought. Still working. She gathered her things. She turned off the light in the assessment office. She walked to the door and stopped for a moment. Not for any particular reason. Sometimes a moment just needed to be stood and acknowledged before you moved through it. 4 weeks ago, she had set a single duffel bag against a wall and begun watching. What she had been watching for was exactly this. Not the mat, not the demonstration, not the moment when the room recognized what she was. Those were necessary, but they weren't the point. The point was the Monday morning when Pierce walked into a session and said, "I learned that recently," and meant it. The point was the Quan record being pulled back out of the system. The point was 75 pages of methodology, building an argument that someone had been trying to make for 3 years without the proof to make it stick. The point was what happened after the room went quiet. She walked out into the corridor. Tomorrow, 0400, she was going to get on the mat with Logan Pierce and help him find the language for the things he knew that he didn't know he knew. And that was going to go into the documentation. And the documentation was going to go into the methodology. And the methodology was going to go to 3 other facilities, and eventually to a briefing room at the regional command, and eventually maybe to the evaluation criteria that shaped every program in the system. That was the long arc of it. She had learned a long time ago to hold the long arc steady while working the immediate problem. The immediate problem was the documentation session. The long arc was everything the documentation session was building toward. She walked down the corridor toward her quarters, and the facility settled around her into its nighttime rhythms. And somewhere in Georgia, a man named Quan had 4 sentences traveling toward him through the institutional system, and somewhere in 3 other facilities, there were programs with the same invisible gap, producing the same invisible damage. And somewhere in a regional command building, there was a briefing room where an argument had been waiting 3 years for the evidence to walk through the door. She was walking toward all of it, one morning at a time. The documentation sessions continued through the 3rd week with a momentum that surprised both of them. Pierce had found his rhythm with the process. He'd stopped trying to translate instinct into language and started simply narrating what he noticed in real time while Evelyn created the force variables on the mat. That shift unlocked something. The material came faster, cleaner, with a specificity that she hadn't expected to achieve until the 2nd month. By the end of the 3rd week, they had documented 47 distinct pattern recognition sequences, each one traced from the initial physical signal through Pierce's internal processing to the response decision. It was some of the most granular instructor cognition data she had ever worked with. On a Wednesday morning, midway through a session, Pierce stopped mid-sequence and said, "You're going to leave." She didn't break her stance immediately. She held the position for a moment, then stepped back. "What?" "After the methodology is finalized," he said. "The regional command is going to move you to the next facility. That's how this works." She set her feet back to neutral. "That was always the arrangement," she said. "The 4-month extension was for this facility. After that, the assignment continues elsewhere." "I know," he said. "I'm not raising an objection. I'm raising it because there's something I need to finish before you go, and I want to make sure we have the time." She looked at him. "What?" "The candidate cohort," he said. "The current 2nd-year group. I want them to work directly with you before you leave. Not just see the framework and the curriculum work with you specifically. Because what you do in a live contact session is not fully captured in the documentation, and they should experience it before it's theory to them." She considered this. "How much time are you thinking?" 3 sessions, he said. Full contact live variable, you running the framework with them directly while I observe. That's your floor time, she said. You're giving me your instruction hours. I'm optimizing the candidate's development window, he said, which is my job. She held his gaze for a moment. The offer was not small. Pierce's instructional floor time was the most valuable resource in the program, and he was proposing to hand it to her without being asked. All right, she said. 3 sessions. He nodded. Returned to position. They ran the sequence again. Later that morning, Yates found Reyes in the equipment bay, running solo drills, and said, Carter's going to run 3 sessions with the second-year cohort. Pierce arranged it. Reyes stopped, looked at him. He gave her his sessions. Yes. She thought about that for a moment. Then she went back to her drill without saying anything, which was her version of a response that didn't need words. The first candidate session happened on a Friday. Evelyn walked into the training room and found 12 second-year candidates arranged in a loose arc, the way Pierce arranged them for demonstration work. Pierce was at the wall, arms crossed, in the specific posture of someone who has decided to observe without influence. He had told the candidates that he would not be instructing this session, that Lieutenant Carter would be running the floor, and that they were to bring everything they had. Evelyn looked at the 12 candidates. She knew their records by now. She'd reviewed every assessment file in the facility as part of the methodology work. She knew where each of them was strong, where each of them had the pattern recognition gap, what each of them tended to do under pressure that wasn't serving them. We're going to work on something uncomfortable today, she said. Not physically uncomfortable, cognitively uncomfortable. I'm going to ask you to notice things before you respond to them. Most of you have been trained to close the gap between perception and response as fast as possible. What I'm asking you to do today is slightly different. I'm asking you to hold the perception 1 beat longer before committing to the response. That beat is where the information is. A candidate named Torres, second from the left. Strong physical metrics, persistent difficulty under high variable conditions, said, "Won't that slow the response?" In the short term, yes, she said. That's why it's uncomfortable. In the longer term, the beat becomes so small it's functionally invisible, but you retain the information content. Right now, your responses are fast and information poor. We're going to temporarily slow them down to make them information-rich. Then we'll rebuild the speed. Torres looked at her with the specific expression of someone who was unconvinced but willing to try. Good, she said, though he hadn't said anything further. That face is exactly the right face to make. Keep it. Something shifted in the room. Not laughter, something lighter than that, a release of tension that made the air a slightly different temperature. Pierce at the wall watched it happen and said nothing. They ran for 2 hours. Evelyn moved through the candidates individually, creating force variables that were specifically calibrated to each person's documented gap, and talked them through the recognition sequence in real time while the contact was happening. It was a teaching style that required her to simultaneously manage the physical exchange, monitor the candidate's response pattern, and narrate the cognitive layer, a level of parallel processing that she'd developed over years in the classified unit and that nobody at Redstone had seen applied to candidate instruction before. By the 90-minute mark, Torres was doing something he had never done in 2 years of advanced training. He was holding the beat. Not perfectly. He was still committing slightly early, still losing information at the transition point. But the gap between his perception and his response had measurably widened, and in that gap, he was catching signals he'd been missing. She could see it in the quality of his adjustments. They were arriving from a different place than before, from the data rather than from habit. At the 2-hour mark, she called the session. The candidates were breathing hard, not from physical exertion, but from sustained cognitive effort, which was its own kind of fatigue. Torres said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Where does this come from?" he said. "This framework. Pierce didn't teach it, at least not the way you're running it. Where did you develop it?" She considered how much of the honest answer she could give without touching the restricted portions of her record. "In environments where the standard approach wasn't available," she said. "Where the candidates I was working with were going to be in situations where strength dominance was not going to be the deciding variable. I had to find a way to prepare them for conditions that strength-based training couldn't address." What kind of environments? Torres said. The kind that don't appear in unclassified documentation, she said. Torres nodded. He looked at the mat for a moment. Were you ever in those environments yourself? Not just training for them, actually in them. The room had gone quiet. 12 candidates, all of them realizing they were asking a question that might have a significant answer. Pierce at the wall had gone very still. She said, "Yes." Nobody spoke for a moment. "Is that why you move the way you do?" Torres said. "Not like someone who's trained the technique, like someone who's used it." "Yes," she said. The quality of the silence that followed was different from any silence the training room had held before. Something had been handed to the candidates in that moment that wasn't in any curriculum document. The understanding that the woman running their session had been in the actual conditions, not the simulated ones, and that the framework she was teaching them had been tested in the place where failure was not recoverable. Reyes, who was in the second row, looked at Pierce. Pierce was looking at Evelyn with an expression that she couldn't fully read from across the room, but that had something in it that she recognized after a moment as a kind of retrospective understanding. The look of a man recalibrating again, the distance between what he'd assumed on day one and what had been standing in front of him. Evelyn said, "Same time next week. Bring the same discomfort you brought today. It means you're in the right place." She walked off the floor. Pierce fell into step beside her in the corridor, which he'd started doing naturally over the past 3 weeks without either of them commenting on it. They walked in silence for a moment. Then he said, "You told them." Torres asked a direct question, she said. He deserved a direct answer. "You could have deflected." "I could have," she said. "I chose not to." Pierce was quiet for a beat. "Why?" She thought about it. "Because they're second-year advanced candidates who are going to be deployed into conditions that will test everything they know," she said. "They should understand that the framework they're learning was forged in those conditions, not designed for them in an office. That's not classified. That's just true." Pierce nodded slowly. "It changed something in the room," he said. "I know. Torres has been resistant to the pattern recognition work," Pierce said. "I've watched him fight the discomfort for 2 weeks. After what you just said, he stopped fighting it. He understood what the discomfort was for," she said. "People can endure a great deal of difficulty when they understand the purpose." Pierce was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "That's what you did with me." She glanced at him. "You didn't tell me why the framework mattered until I was ready to hear it," he said. "You showed me what it could do first. Then you told me where it came from." He paused. "Same sequence. Different timeline." "You needed longer," she said. "The candidates are younger and more flexible. You had 11 years of established framework to revise. They have 2. Is that the diplomatic version? It's the accurate version, she said. Older framework, more revision required. That's not a criticism. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I suppose it isn't. They reached the intersection where their paths separated, his toward the command office, hers toward the assessment office, and Pierce stopped. The Quan reassessment, he said. Marsh called me this morning. She turned. Something in his tone had changed. What did he say? The review board met yesterday, Pierce said. The reassessment is confirmed. Quan's record has been formally revised. The inconsistent performer flag has been removed and replaced with a notation that the original evaluation was conducted under an incomplete assessment framework. He paused. He's been offered re-entry to the advanced program. She absorbed that. What did Quan say? He accepted, Pierce said. He reports to Redstone in 3 weeks. The corridor held that for a moment. How are you feeling about it? She said. Pierce looked at her directly. Honestly? Honestly. Relieved, he said. And still responsible. The reassessment corrects the record. It doesn't give him back the 19 months. He held her gaze. I don't think I'm supposed to feel better about it just because the process worked. No, she said quietly. You're not. But you can feel better about the fact that you initiated it. That was your choice. Nobody required it. It was the right thing, he said. That's not a virtue. That's just the minimum. She looked at him for a moment. There it was again, the thing that had been emerging through all the documentation sessions and corridor conversations and 0400 mornings. The version of Pierce that had been present the whole time, underneath the posture and the authority and the absolute certainty. The version that held himself to a standard that was harder and more honest than the one he required of others. "You know," she said, "when I arrived at Redstone, I read your file." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "Your combat record," she said. "Your evaluation history. Your candidate outcomes over 11 years. And the picture I got was of a man who was formidable and effective and institutionally important and very probably resistant to change." She paused. "I was right about 4 of those things." He looked at her for a moment. "Which 4? "I'll let you work it out," she said. She walked toward the assessment office. Behind her, she heard Pierce make a sound that was short and quiet and had the shape of something that might from another man have been called a laugh. The second candidate session went further than the first. By the third, the 12 candidates were operating with a measurably different quality of contact than they'd had at the start of the month. Evelyn ran the final session with a specific structure. She had each candidate work a live sequence and then stop and narrate in real time what they had noticed at the pre-contact stage. The narration requirement was the hardest part. It forced the cognitive process above the waterline, made it visible, made it something that could be examined and refined rather than just felt. Torres, on his turn, narrated a recognition sequence that was so precise and so correctly ordered that Pierce, standing at the wall arms, crossed, maintaining his observer posture, uncrossed his arms. It was a small movement, involuntary, and only 3 people in the room caught it. Reyes caught it. Holloway caught it. Evelyn caught it. When the session ended, Pierce walked onto the floor for the first time in 3 sessions. He stood in front of the 12 candidates and said, "What you did in this room over the past 3 weeks is going into the permanent curriculum, not as an optional module, as foundational instruction. Every cohort that comes through this program from now on starts here." He looked at each of them in turn. "You're the first. What that means is that you have an obligation to it, to know it well enough to pass it forward when you're the one standing where I'm standing." He paused. "Don't waste that." He walked off the floor. It was by the standards of Pierce's economy, with words and extraordinary speech. Yates, who had been observing from the doorway, stood there after everyone cleared and thought about the fact that 6 weeks ago, this man had laughed at a suggestion to adjust a foot angle. Now he was putting that suggestion's underlying framework into the permanent curriculum and telling his candidates they had an obligation to carry it forward. That was the arc of it, from the laugh to the obligation. He went and wrote it in his training notebook because he was the kind of person who wrote things down when he understood that they mattered, and he understood that this mattered. The methodology document reached its final version on a Thursday in the 11th week, 83 pages. Evelyn sent it to Marsh at 0800. He confirmed receipt at 0812 and scheduled the regional command briefing for the following Tuesday. She told Pierce that afternoon. He said, "How long is the briefing?" 2 hours, she said. Marsh is presenting the evaluation criteria argument directly to the regional command board. The methodology is the evidence base. "Will it work?" Pierce said. "The argument is solid," she said. "The evidence is stronger than anything they've had before. Whether it works depends on the board." She paused. "These things usually take multiple cycles. One briefing rarely changes a system." "But it starts the cycle," Pierce said. "Yes, it starts the cycle." He nodded. "That's enough," he said. "Starting something real is enough." She looked at him. "You've changed," she said. Not gently, not carefully. Just as an observation stated plainly the way Pierce stated things. He met her eyes. "I know," he said. "The man who said combat isn't a classroom 6 weeks ago wouldn't have said starting something real is enough," she said. "He would have needed to see the outcome to accept the process. The man who said that," Pierce said, "had never had a process work the way this one worked." He paused. He'd also never been put on a mat and shown something he didn't know existed. He held her gaze. "I don't recommend it as a teaching method generally, but in this particular case, I don't think anything else would have opened the door." "No," she said. I don't think it would have. Was that why you didn't refuse the challenge? He said. You knew the mat was the only way in. She held his gaze for a long moment. I knew it was a possible way in, she said. I didn't know what would happen after. That part depended on you. Pierce was quiet. What if I hadn't taken the hand? He said. She thought about it honestly. Then I would have revised the approach, she said. Found a different angle. It would have taken longer and produced less. She paused. But I wouldn't have given up on the program. The candidates here deserved the revision regardless of whether you chose to partner in it. He absorbed that. You would have worked around me. I would have worked with what was available, she said. You made yourself available. That's the difference. He nodded once. Then, where's the next facility? Fort Calloway, she said. Oklahoma. I report in 6 weeks. What do you know about the senior instructor there? Less than I knew about you when I arrived here, she said. Which is the way I prefer it. I don't want to arrive with a fixed assessment. Pierce looked at her. 12 years at Calloway, he said. His name is Sergeant Major Whitfield. I've met him twice at regional conferences. He paused. He's not going to be easy. Are you warning me? I'm telling you what I know, he said. He's a different kind of resistance than I was. I was dismissive because I didn't have the information. Whitfield has the information and has decided it doesn't apply to him. That's harder to work with. She filed that. Thank you, she said. One more thing, Pierce said. She waited. The documentation, he said. The 83 pages. My 11 years of pattern data. He paused. You're taking that to Calloway. It's part of the methodology, she said. Yes. Then Whitfield is going to be working with evidence that I spent 3 months producing, he said. He doesn't know that yet. Something moved through his expression, not quite humor, but its functional equivalent. Make sure it lands correctly. I will, she said. He stood. Extended his hand, not the way he'd extended it on the mat, as an acknowledgement of what had happened. This time simply as one professional to another, as an equal, with the clean directness of someone who had decided this was the appropriate thing to do and was doing it. She shook it. Carter, he said. Sergeant Major. Whatever's in that restricted file, he said. I'm glad it's in there. She looked at him for a moment. So am I, she said. He walked out. The Tuesday briefing at the regional command lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. Marsh presented the evaluation criteria argument with the methodology as his evidence base, and the Redstone curriculum revision as his proof of concept. Pierce participated remotely as agreed. He answered 3 questions from the board about the documentation sessions and the candidate outcomes in his specific flat direct register without hedging or qualification. The board asked him directly whether he believed the evaluation criteria revision was operationally necessary. He said yes. He said it was operationally necessary, institutionally important, and long overdue. He said it the way Pierce said everything without seeking permission, without softening as a statement of observed fact. The board voted to open a formal review of the regional evaluation criteria. Not to change them, the change would take cycles as Evelyn had said. But the review was the cycle beginning, the thread being pulled. The thing that Marsh had been waiting 3 years for someone to make possible. Evelyn got the call from Marsh at 1800 on Tuesday. The review opens next month, he said. The methodology is the foundational document. Understood, she said. Fort Calloway, he said. Your orders have been processed. You report in 5 weeks. Yes, sir. A pause. Carter, he said. Sir, what you built at Redstone, he said. The methodology, the curriculum revision, the comprehensive record review. But also, what you built with Pierce. That's the part that made the board move. Not the document. The fact that Pierce sat in front of 3 regional command officers and said, I made a wrong call, and then described the process by which he identified and corrected it. A pause. That doesn't happen. You made that happen. Pierce made that happen, she said. I gave him the framework. He built the house. You know that's not all you did. It's the part that matters, she said. Marsh was quiet for a moment. Fort Calloway, he said. Whitfield, watch your back. I've been told, she said. Thank you, sir. She disconnected. The last week at Redstone arrived, the way last week's, due full of ordinary things that carried an extra weight because they were the last time. The last documentation session, which Pierce ran past 0600 because there was one more sequence he wanted to get into the record. The last candidate review, where Torres demonstrated a pattern recognition sequence that was so clean and so complete that Evelyn made a note in the methodology citing it as the benchmark for second-year cohort standard. The last evening in the assessment office, where she sat with the file system and confirmed that everything was correctly archived and accessible and ready for the instructor who would eventually continue the work. Pierce found her there at 2000, later than she usually stayed. You're checking the files, he said. Making sure everything transfers cleanly, she said. It will, he said. I'll make sure it does. She looked up. I know you will. He sat down across from her the last time he would sit in that chair across from that desk, in a way that was their session posture, their working posture, the posture of two people who had spent 3 months building something carefully in the space between them. Quan arrives in 2 weeks, he said. Are you ready for that? No, he said honestly. But I'll be ready by the time he gets here. She nodded. I've been thinking about what I'm going to say to him, Pierce said. When he arrives, the first thing. What have you come up with? Nothing satisfactory, he said. Everything I draft sounds like a formal statement, and what I want to say isn't formal. What do you want to say? I was quiet for a moment. That I looked at him through a lens that wasn't calibrated correctly, he said, and that I'm going to spend however long it takes to give him the evaluation he should have had the first time. He paused. And that I'm sorry for the 19 months. Not institutionally. Personally. She looked at him. Then say that, she said. Exactly that. It's not the kind of thing a sergeant major says to a subordinate, he said. It's not, she said. It's the kind of thing a person says to another person when they've caused harm and they know it. She held his gaze. You've been a sergeant major for 11 years. You've been a person for longer. Let the person talk. Pierce looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face had the quality of a man who was holding something carefully, not suppressing it, holding it. The way you hold something that matters. All right, he said quietly. They sat in silence for a moment that didn't need to be filled. Then Pierce said, when you get to Calloway, when Whitfield does whatever Whitfield is going to do, remember that the framework works even when the first conversation goes badly. She looked at him. You told me that in the second week, he said. You said the methodology works regardless of the senior instructor's response. It just works at a different level. You were talking about the other facilities, but you meant it generally. He paused. It helped me understand what you were doing, even before I was ready to work with it. She absorbed that. You knew what I was doing before you admitted it. I knew something was happening, he said. I didn't have language for it, but I knew the mat wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. He paused. Most people who beat someone in a demonstration walk away with the win. You didn't walk away. That was the thing that made it different. She held his gaze. You took my hand, she said. That was the thing that made it different. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once slowly. Fair, he said. He stood. What time is your transport? 0600, she said. I'll be up, he said. You don't need to. I know I don't need to, he said. 0600. He walked out. She turned back to the files. She sat with them for another hour, not because they needed the time, but because the assessment office had become a place she had come to know the way. You know, a place where significant work has happened, the particular quality of its quiet, the way the ventilation ran the strip of corridor light under the door. She was going to carry this room with her the way she carried all the rooms where important things had been built, at 0558. The next morning, she walked through the main corridor toward the east exit, with her duffel bag over one shoulder, and the facility was still in its early morning mode, not yet fully activated, But stirring the first candidates arriving for 0600 conditioning work, Delray's light already on in the operations office. Pierce was at the east exit. He was in his full-duty uniform, which was either respect or habit with Pierce. It was probably both. He was standing straight, arms at his sides, and when she approached, he didn't say anything immediately. Just looked at her with an expression that had layers in it she could read all the way down. Then he said, "You changed something here that needed to be changed." "We changed it," she said. "No," he said. "You started it. Give yourself the accurate version." She held his gaze. "All right," she said. "We finished it together." He nodded. "Whitfield," he said. "Whatever happens, don't let him make you doubt the framework." "I won't," she said. "And if you need—" He stopped. "If the regional methodology needs a case study reference, someone to speak to the process from the inside." He met her eyes. "You know where I am." "I do," she said. She put out her hand. He shook it. Clean, firm, the handshake of two people who had built something real and knew it. She walked out into the early morning and crossed the facility toward the transport point, and behind her Redstone Tactical Training Center settled into its morning rhythm. The candidates arriving. The conditioning sessions, starting Quan's name already on the incoming roster. The curriculum that had been rebuilt now running on its second month. The 83-page methodology sitting in the regional command system as the foundational document for a formal evaluation criteria review that was going to take years and produce something that neither of them would be able to fully see from where they stood. And somewhere in Oklahoma, a man named Whitfield was preparing for a day that he did not yet know was coming. That was how it always started. One facility, one resistant system, one person willing to walk onto the mat and show the room something true. The force was already moving. She knew